Is that the mirror test, like for AI?
Maybe. I cannot prompt it to create a picture of a robot painting a portrait of a human. Hi, welcome to this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today my guest is Nathaniel Hendrickson. Nathaniel Hendrickson is a native of Kentucky. But he's got his Master of Fine Arts degree from Florida State University. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Nathan and I are going to talk about art and artificial intelligence. Before we get started, I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you, from an art standpoint, like I know that you are a painter, a curator, filmmaker, and what else? That sounds like a lot. And a performer, performance art. What else? What else about yourself?
I'll just be really brief. Since graduating from Florida State, I had the chance to work with international theater company based in Pontedera, Italy. It was the work center of Jerzy Grotowski and Thomas Richards. I worked with them on some projects in the Bronx, specifically a community theater piece on the mass incarceration in the United States called Will Be Heard. And that was a really my sort of introduction into sort of community theater, international theater. And that was at the Andrew Friedman Home in the Bronx. And since that time, I've been sort of working internationally. I work highly collaboratively, much like in film, where you have directors, writers, actors. So I often work in environments, or I create conditions where I'm working collaboratively, and also blurring the lines of authorship with my work is naturally what happens. Sharing authorship. So I think with questions of artificial intelligence, these kind of things come into play. But yeah, that's sort of a very brief overview. And then afterwards, I think I got more into doing theater and installation, especially in nature. So I worked on some projects in Belgium recently that were specifically designed to take young people into forests and live and work together for several weeks at a time. And the point of that being to sort of unplug from the network in a way and create a different sort of relationship among us, and maybe engage with the more than human world in a sort of maybe even engage our instincts to sort of bring us back to the senses that we are sort of losing by being sort of embedded in a very human architecture.
So it's one thing to look at nature, it's another to be fully immersed in it.
Yes.
If I understand what
you're
talking about.
Right, so this is like pre-Kantian sort of aesthetics. So instead of like, Kant, the sublime was like watching from a distance and being like in awe of the power of nature, but in a way like not really inside of it. Whereas, Nietzsche was trying to revive the sort of Dionysian aesthetics, which is like an aesthetics of in the flow, like going into the flow of the dangerous
Nietzsche
thing.
had such an influence on art.
He was interested in, especially going against this sort of aesthetics of where tragedy in his time, tragedy was being sort of smoothed over with happy endings. And so he was interested in...
Not much has changed.
Right. So he was saying, let's go back to real tragedy and actually go... And in a way, he died in a kind of post-human tragedy because he sort of like fell into a catatonic state just after reaching out and hugging a horse. So he's like reaching for this being which could somehow give him some kind of experience beyond the human, and then it wasn't enough for him, and he then fell into a sort of catatonic state. Yeah. So the tragedy also of his own life. Yeah.
Reaching towards something, trying to grasp it.
Yeah, that's bigger than you, much bigger than you, and more powerful than you, maybe.
And getting really close, but never quite having that connection, perhaps.
Yeah. So that's the kind of work I'm interested in. That's what I've been working on since graduating from FSU. And then I kind of integrate these ideas into more studio practices and make paintings and drawings and installations. But my passion is in this kind of like, I don't know, the way like an anthropologist or even biologists may do field research, like going into the wild and making contact with forces or with different species, and to learn and glean something from that encounter.
So is there, do you create art while you're there, whether it be, and again, I'm not sure, but if somebody is compelled to create a rock formation as some sort of altar, or I don't know. So is that part of it, or can you just be an observer? And is it about somehow compelling yourself towards art? Because I'm just curious. It sounds like a really interesting concept.
Well, it's all kind of it's unique to each person. So I work in a lot of different ways. And I also like to work with young people, like as a teacher or as a guide. And so I think it can be everywhere from something where you just are experiencing and you're sort of almost keeping a journal or a field notebook, to actually making interventions in and installations in the space, or making a series of actions as a guide. For example, one of the students from the group this past year was interested in climbing trees, and so he would take people on climbing trees with him up the tree, and sort of experiencing the tree and all of the aspects of what it means for him to climb a tree, but also meeting you where you are and your ability to climb a tree and so on, all the way to someone actually making an installation or making a sound piece where they're like reacting to the sounds of animals or of nature.
Now, they leave these pieces. It's something that you come and you do and leave.
Some of it's ephemeral, right? Like a performance, and some is like an installation or an object.
But you leave it there in situ, if you will.
For example, yes.
And then you go away, and you have your memories, and you have your
maybe you took
experience.
Maybe you took a photograph of it to document it, or a video. I made a documentary of the first encounter we did. So you can find it online.
And is this in Italy? Is that what?
No, this was in Nanine, Belgium.
Belgium. But you could do it in Kentucky or Texas.
And actually I have plans to do a similar project of this kind, actually at the Soil Factory in Ithaca, New York, this summer. So, I'm really interested in creating these kind of encounters, and also the axis of the work is not just about making things, but it's about sharing space in a convivial way that goes a little bit beyond this sort of individualistic way of living that in society, which has, in some ways, antithetical to our origins as a species, because we
Sure.
are pack animals. We work in this way, and also we have evolved from animals, a strain of animals which are also very pack-oriented, like other baboons and other primates.
Oh, when you said pack-oriented, I thought you meant mules.
No, but
I know. So I probably fit that category for stubbornness sometimes.
no,
Go ahead.
but mainly in
I understand what you're
sort
saying.
of primates.
So we're social.
We're
beings.
social beings.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
Why did you? Like, when did you know you were an artist? Like, what is it that said, yeah, this is me. I'm an artist.
I was actually writing a lot and making drawings in my notebooks as a child. I think 5 years old. I had kept a notebook from that time. I still have it. But I think I was always felt like he was either going to be an artist or a monk, and I decided to be an artist. But it's kind of like
Well, you can be
in
both.
some
I don't
ways
think there's
I still
a preclusion
yeah,
either
right.
way, right?
Right, but it was maybe in junior in high school where I just made that choice, really in my mind, to really continue.
I
this
would be
path.
remiss not to also mention that you are the artist in residence here at Campbellsville University. I don't know if you wanted to bring that up, but
It's perfectly
I'm kidding.
fine. Yeah,
And are you enjoying that?
yeah.
Is that something? I mean,
It's been great. It gave me a lot of chance to, experience where university culture is at. In some ways, also being in a rural setting has been very, very informative for me. Getting that perspective from students, and also the socioeconomic aspect is a bit different in this region. So, sort of meeting people where they are in that sense has been very enlightening, but also just getting a sort of taste of the different, the different goals of the departments, both the theater and the design and music department. It's been nice to really experience the breadth of what is still possible at a small, liberal arts
Absolutely.
university.
well, they do all of that well.
Yes, they do very
To
well.
the degree it's interdisciplinary, I guess. I'm not sure. I mean, whether
is.
it's music or theater or art, I mean, it's all done really well. But I don't know how well they integrate together.
There's a lot of conversation and cross-pollinating, I think, outside the classroom. I'm not so sure between but
Structurally, they may not be a lot of integration, but in terms of interest and in terms of ideas, it sounds like there's, as you call it, cross-pollination.
yeah, it's been really great, and in some ways it's kept me on my toes, just being in that kind of environment. I came from my master's program, and it was basically a post-studio practice for me. I was working in dance and theater. I mean, my committee was, a theater director, a dance historian, and theorist.
So when you
and
say you're
performance artist.
interdisciplinary, you're bringing it all.
Yeah.
You like it all and bring it to your art.
Yes, I'm integrating as much of the media as I can in the work that I'm doing, including documenting my own work, like making documentaries of pedagogical encounters, or making objects to making things about making objects. I don't know if that makes sense.
So that that integration is also collaboration, because it sounds like collaboration is important. Why is that important to you?
I think I'm really interested in this obsession with self, that is so like embedded in our society,
Yeah.
and it's a kind of limited form of self, because when I read, for example, if I'm reading books about the field work or notebooks of biologists or anthropologists, it's often like the experiences that are transformative for them are the ones in which their experience of self is expanded. For example, there's experiences like what many, it's hard to quantify scientifically. They're mostly ethnographic experiences, but ones of spiritual experiences where, for example, you're with a group of people and you're doing something, or a group of animals, and suddenly everyone is all on the same page.
Yeah.
Or there's this experience of contemplation with a bunch of of beings that you would think don't have sentience, or at least what we call human intelligence, right? But those kind of experiences where there's a sort of the experience of self is expanded, and you suddenly realize you're among intelligent beings, and you're sharing this experiences which is beyond just your own narrow self experience.
It's interesting
of self.
because as you're telling me this, one of the things that comes to mind is, well, if you want to expand, one of the things we hear a lot is that you want to expand your consciousness. Let's say, go out and be alone in nature. And so, wait, if I'm going to be alone, and one of the things that we're already, sort of inclined towards in this society is our role, our individuals, which you've already brought up as our self. But then the idea that we would get out to nature to be able to go beyond self, and sit alone to become one.
Yeah.
At a unity, if you will.
Yeah, I think there's also a sort of, the language is tricky there, right? Because it's to say that you're
Ever more
alone
tricky these days, right?
If you're to say you're alone when you go into nature is already a fallacy, because you're saying I'm by myself. But in fact, it's, if you take that word apart, alone is all one, right?
Yeah.
So if then you say, oh, actually I am among others, and I'm surrounded by other beings, and microorganisms exist inside me and everywhere, and I'm a collection, an assemblage of all those organisms.
Well, and it's symbolic of the journey, right? So we do go as a spiritual journey, starting with self and the idea of alone, and as we move into this greater consciousness where we're connecting with nature or one another, then we do get that feeling of all one. So that's one of the things that is interesting about that. We, the spiritual journey, we have to recognize self-awareness, if you will, or sentience, but we consciously make a decision, most of us, to move towards something that is this greater understanding of the world, and being able, and from what I hear you say, if I understand you, that's a collaborative investment.
Yes, it is, and I think where I'm interested in that, in terms of, I guess, artistic creation or collective creation, is that is like dismantling the mythology of like the genius or of the heroic artist, and to put more at the center a collective mind, or a kind of a cooperative way of working that just shows what we share, even if it's for a limited time, something we share together in this moment. And like, for example, the way, I don't know, I think it comes also from my experience, like as a child, when for example, sing in the choir or something. Okay, yeah, there's a composer, there's a conductor, so on, but without the people singing their part, there's no music, it doesn't come together. So I'm also interested in those kind of experiences, those kind of, that each of one of us has a part to play in the kind of, this dance of the cosmos, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about collaboration is the idea that it's not just the sum of the parts come together. It's greater than the sum of the parts. The whole is expanded, and a lot of that comes from, as you say, the different things we bring to the table, or the different talents or traits, or even an idea that we might not have had on our own without that. I guess that connection with somebody else. And so when I always had this question, because what defines art?
That's a big question. You could write a book on it for sure.
Several probably have, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
You probably had a few in class, right?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, to answer that question, you have to ask really what paradigm or what lens you're looking through, culturally or socially, because if you were to say, in the terms of like a Western historical tradition, what is art? You might say it is in a kind of aesthetics of that is derived from techniques, visual techniques, but in the sense it also includes things like architecture, things like design, painting, sculpture, all the things that involve a kind of manipulation of materials into either a kind of place to live or exist, or to give pleasure to your experience, or even utilitarian objects like plate, things you use to eat, other things like that. So it's something that in some ways either enriches your living experiences, or in maybe even your ritual experience, or maybe something to commemorate, monuments, things of that nature. So it's a really robust field, art, and you could also include media and our tools into that category, and the design or the sort of interface of our tools has a lot to do with art as well. How accessible they are, or the way in which they navigate those interfaces, for example, on website designs or even application design, and so on.
It really it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Ubiquitous to
the human world is art.
Yeah.
This studio is constructed on principles of art.
Yeah.
And design.
Design, yeah.
Yeah. So.
So how would you relate that to the importance of art in society?
I think I think that it is this idea of the Umwelt, which is like the idea of like the way that the way you look at the world. I'm not like a sort of a philosopher or anything by any means, but how I understand the Umwelt is that in a way it's a frame around which you see the world. And so art in terms of society, or let's say human world, it gives a frame to your experience of what is possible. Or even
So that sounds multi-leveled or multi-variabled, because we have our own, the things that we like. Then we have community, in let's say church, maybe, or school, institutional, and then you have the broader society. I mean, our flag is a aesthetic, if you will. It's a symbol of the country, and so it sounds like all of this impacts us. Some of it we choose, some of it we're sort of embedded in.
Yeah, it's
if I'm understanding, I like the idea. I like the sort of the metaphor of the frame.
Yeah.
Or analogy. I don't know, whatever. But
yeah.
Well, that makes sense.
You could say that also, the doctrine upon which our nation is founded is also a frame. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
But it also is porous, right? Because it can be changed. Like you see, it has amendments, right? It has been, since it's been written, right? It has been revised or amended in various ways. But yet the document still exists within a frame and within a certain kind of lens upon which you look through it. So you could also argue
including
that.
the original, the era in which it was framed,
yes.
And now this era and how we're looking back on that,
mm-hmm.
and all of that's if I understand, all of that would be in the frame from a sense of art and how it impacts society.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when we start speaking in categories. You always limiting the frame, but it's like if we say, oh, we're speaking in terms of art. Well, art is a frame that is very vast. Like it's a huge frame. So, I mean, it's like it's a form of looking at the world through a certain kind of set of parameters or a certain lens, but it's not necessarily limited to. It's not. I mean, the way that contemporary artists are working nowadays is in no way limited to the realm of aesthetics. I mean, they are working in social practices. They're working with philosophers, anthropologists, like scientists that are collaborating to write a paper. That's the way that contemporary art is moving. You're working in teams. You're working with architects, with
that's an interesting concept, because what I'm hearing you say is art is fundamental to who we are and how we express ourselves.
Yeah.
And it also sounds like in how we collaborate with each other, and so it's really something that we can't.
You can't just say that art is the thing that you hang on the wall, because that's immediately limiting the definition of what it is. The art is the wall, and you hanging it, and the thing itself.
So from your perspective, what's the importance of being able to conceptualize art as a much broader, multifaceted experience for humans?
I think it's just it's a question of education, I don't know. The fact that, when you say the word art in a certain social or cultural context, someone is going to think, oh, you mean like the thing that you get, you buy and put in a frame and put on your wall? Or do you mean like everything that makes up the human, all the technique and technologies that surround us? The things that's in your pocket, the way your clothes are designed, the way you dress your hair, all of that, even the design of your teeth. Like, for example, if you have dentures or, your teeth have been straightened. I mean, all of this is art, in a sense, the aesthetics of beauty that define us as a people.
So there it sounded like you are art and beauty, or you're putting it sort of in the, at least that was what I sort of understood, is that art and beauty are synonymous, maybe?
Well, you could say there.
I may be oversimplifying your idea, or maybe trying to.
It was an example, right?
Right.
For example, we could also say there's an aesthetics of what is ugly, right? There is an aesthetics of what is abject, right? Things that repulse you, or there's an aesthetics of what is objective, right? Scientific aesthetics, right? An aesthetics of there are aesthetics that can be ascribed to each of our sort of crafts as humans, right?
So in some ways, and again, I'm exploring. This is why I called it Help Me Understand, because art might be at a higher level value than we've sort of maybe thought of it. Most of us have thought of it. So art would be a reflection of a value, but maybe what I'm hearing is that art is actually a value into itself, that some of these other things fall.
Everything we do as humans involves art. That's my argument. And I think that, from, the choices you make, the places where you choose to source your food, to where the things that you put on yourself, or the places you surround yourself with, the places you build, the things that you do every day is art. The habits, your habitus, is art.
And so to bringing that back to just real quickly, bringing it back to the idea of why that matters to society, is that in some ways we're all artists.
Yes, we are.
And we live in an artistic community, because if we're all artists,
the human world is a community of artists, of art. It is constructed. Well, the moment we picked up the fire, like you said, and we started making tools, we made our world. We did not. It was not no longer the world where we are afraid of predators, or we started creating worlds.
We moved out of that sort of natural order. I don't like, that's not really a good.
We are still in it, right? But we have delineated ourselves and created our own Umwelt. We've created a sort of world apart.
And I'll use that as a segue to bring us to talking about art and artificial intelligence. And first, let me just ask about artificial intelligence, and just get I guess a brief take on that. So, in terms of without getting too deep, but just sort of like where you stand. Yeah, just talk to me about artificial intelligence. What are your thoughts? How about that? Let's go with that.
Okay. I think the artificial intelligence has been among us for some time. What I mean by that is that our technical development from the Industrial Revolution to today is one of intelligence, even before. But we create machines which operate along a certain set of rules, and the paradigm shift for us from a machine that requires input to a sort of machine that could operate on its own. We are reaching that point right now. So so I think that artificial intelligence is already among us, and we are using it every day in by taking out your cell phone.
Well, if I understand, I mean, even anything that, I mean, a car would be.
There's a certain level of intelligence, in design of a car.
And we've been with that for a while. And if we go back to some of the industrial stuff, I mean, I kind of understand the track you're on, or where you were coming from, is that conveyor belt and the assembly line processes.
Yeah.
Whenever there was a tool that did something that a human would have done, augmenting that, either augmenting what the human could do or replacing that human altogether, which has been happening and it has been happening for a while now, is artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's the seeds of what is now. Those are the sort of antecedents that have led to this point. And of course, I would also say that the other important evolution happened just before or during World War II with Alan Turing's thesis, which basically he was responsible for
decoding.
Decoding a lot things.
The encrypted.
Encrypting. Yeah, right. What was a kind of communication encryption, but also he posited basically the first computer, and he had two different hypotheses. One was a Turing machine, which we have today, which is a machine that's based on input. And then the other one, which he did not end up creating, or did not end up. It was not a machine that was then developed. Was what he called an oracle machine, or a machine which does not rely on input for its operation. So since his thesis, we have.
Just to be clear, when you say an input for the operations, a beginning point for a machine to do whatever it's programmed to do.
Right.
Okay.
It needs human input to operate. So, or it needs an outside. It needs commands basically to move. Whereas the oracle machine is one that's it operates along a different paradigm, one that operates closer to like a dynamic homeostasis or something like that.
More organic.
Yeah, and fluid.
I guess one of the things that comes to mind is with the and Turing seeming to be the beginning of that, of what we now consider machine learning sort of thing. It's very computational. It's all based on a data-driven interpretation of the world that then has some output, like a prediction, if you will. The oracle would be a little bit more organic, and probably far more computational, but in very high level and sophisticated ways, just like nature is, that we don't quite really understand how we see observations and we're like, wow, nature's really
based on existing systems, right? Or the oracle machine, this idea would be based on modeling, right? Existing systems that could offer some kind of way of organizing a system. Or, for example, there's a great book on being that talks about some of the experiments that were done by industrialists. There was this wild industrialist who thought, wow, I could potentially organize the production of a factory based on the organic organic molecules inside of a pond. So if you were to somehow find a way to measure the changes of certain organisms within a natural ecosystem, this could give you a model for production that is more in line with natural systems, or without having to create any data points.
By leveraging, and if I guess a thought that comes to mind, leveraging that to be more efficient and more effective.
Right, and maybe not
overproducing
or creating surplus, unnecessary surplus or whatever. So if you could model, if you choose the right, system to model after, you could potentially answer a lot of problems, so like both economic and socially, even the global economic system.
Let's be honest, economics the only one that matters, right?
I would say so.
Well, it's the one that seems to be the only one that matters.
Well, it's the one that drives all of our decisions in this country, especially. Being that we live in a country where the economic powers are the powers, and the rest are subservient.
Yeah. Even art?
Even in art.
So let's lighten it up a little bit.
Sure.
Let's talk about how art is going to be impacted by artificial intelligence.
It's already been impacted. Well, first of all, this question of authorship comes into play immediately. It has been also already implied for some time. I think as early as, for example, William Burroughs' experiments with what he called the cut-up, which was where it was also a technique devised by Brian Geisen, but they were interested in techniques of divination, right? How you could
finding water, or
no, a different kind of divination.
Not divination,
not dowsing. Yeah,
Gotcha.
Yeah, which is another conversation altogether. But it also involves a kind of intelligence. But what they were interested in was, at what point does a text become something else, or what they call the third mind. So you start cutting the text up. They would cut it into, for example, 4 quarters. You reorganize the text, and you then write it again in this new order, and then try to give it some sense, maybe, or grammar, correct it a little bit. And then
same text but reordered.
Text reordered.
Seeing what sense comes out of that.
What sense comes out of that. And the more you reorder a text, and the more there's some other kind of mind appears outside of the text, or between the lines of the text, if you will. And this is what they were interested in. This was before computers were even, thought of, or maybe they were in the early stages of development. But in a way, they were sort of science fiction aficionados, like imagining the frontiers of artificial intelligence before it even arrived. And so this idea of the third mind is something that has been among us for some time, and I think is what is then enabled in augmenting our intelligence through technology. So, for example, now you can keep a calendar, that reminds you when you need to do something, right? So it's like a clock.
Offloading the menial.
Right. This is like a clock, right? That also gives you some efficiency, right? You say, okay, now I program my calendar to tell me when I have an appointment. For example, the appointment with you today, it told me 2 hours before and 1 hour before, so I have 2 warnings.
Right.
So this is also, for me, a question of artificial intelligence. But then now we're going toward something more creative, or what they call hallucinating, with artificial intelligence, which is basically having a machine generate original ideas from existing human created
The generative
images.
art.
Right.
as
So,
an
for example, right. So, generative art, what maybe they also call hallucinations or whatever you want to call it, where they essentially are combing the internet or databases for either images or text, and essentially creating a new synthesis of existing images.
Which is really assembling.
Yeah, it's something that a collage, for example, or if you make a digital collage or a composite image from several images, it's something that's been in practice since even dall-e was probably the first after the Second World War. This sort of like practice of cutting up newspaper or different photographs and reassembling them and to create new images from existing images, essentially. So that's where we are right now. We're at this point.
Now, what were you calling that? Illusory?
Hallucination.
Hallucination.
Yeah, this is what the programmers of these kinds of, this is one terminology that's used to describe this technique, or call it like deep dreaming. For example, Google has a kind of AI, which they call, when it creates images from existing images, they call it dreaming or whatever, or hallucinating or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
And essentially that's going out, finding, based on a prompt,
Yeah, based on
going out and finding something that has been categorized
as such,
as labeled
right.
as that, and then you bring it back and assemble it and based on the prompt, and then get feedback from the user how close that was.
Right. You
And
can
then iteratively you could maybe finally get to the thing, or something that you didn't imagine in the beginning comes out, but it's because you drove that.
right.
Is that?
But there's also, existing. I'm not an expert of the software behind this kind of things, but what I understand is that there are some parameters that, for example, you can give the programs an image, for example, a picture of your dog or whatever, and then what the program does is it, just like any other, for example, like focusing or camera softwares, it tries to find edges or other ways of organizing the picture, and then inserts images within those edges or within those boundaries. So, for example, if I were
So it would clip your dog, so if I understand.
you could say
Clip your dog and then put your dog flying through outer space or something, or
right.
in another collage, or create a collage based on that clip, if I'm understanding.
Yeah,
a little
and
bit.
to varying degrees, right? You can, in some cases, there's programs you can decide what intensity the original image has. So if you will see some remnants of that original image, whether it be the outline or whatever, will it remain, or some evidence of that image remain, to like completely creating a new image altogether and barely any evidence of your original image being.
Another thing that it seems to do really well is mimic style, artistic style.
Yeah, and this is something that has been around for some time. Like, for example, Photoshop. There are all these filters, and there's certain paintbrushes in certain graphic design softwares that can mimic certain kinds of techniques that are analog techniques in painting or in sculpture and so on. So
some of the people that I've read are a little bit upset that, let's say you have a certain brush style or certain style of art, whether it be creating digital art or whatever, it could take your style and mimic that, and now it's not attributed to you, but you worked years and years on that style.
Yeah.
And now it can be used as another filter, another a piece of it.
Yeah, there's a question of copyright, and I think that our laws around copyright have been dramatically impacted for quite some time because of programming language, not just artificial programming language, but programming language in general. But also our understanding of rights and of not just copyright, but other kinds of laws around use and reuse are really at the point of being out of date completely or obsolete, because or needing to be rewritten in some way to accommodate for these kinds of things. Because, for example, I mean, if you, for example, are a content creator, you know, let's say on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, you know, you signed an agreement with those companies that in some way, in some cases, they own what you produce or some part of it, or maybe the distribution of it or whatever.
That proprietary knowledge that is theirs now.
Right.
Even though it's you did it, they own the knowledge.
Right. So there's a little bit like tricky stuff going on under the radar all the time nowadays in this sort of digital augmented world. And so, you know, people like Jaron Lanier and others are really trying to go against that. And I think there are some laws that have been passed recently which have put sort of power back into the users' hands. At least, for example, like things like in Europe, there are, you know, you can decide how much of your data is being used when you visit a website or so on. You know, those kinds of things those kind of questions are also being considered, you know, when it comes to these kind of platforms as well. So I think the conversation is constantly evolving. Also, there's an issue too of royalties, for example. For example, if someone is using your style, is there a way to trace the use, or like through the metadata or whatever, of that particular style? And perhaps you could get royalties as a creator of that style, right? So that's been something that, you know, there are people designing algorithms to trace these things.
Use somebody's, and this happens all the time. You know, you go to find a photo from some photo catalog, you use it, you pay them however much, you know, a
kind of royalty
fee, and then you can use it on, you know, on your product catalog or whatever it is. So that's one, and that makes a lot of sense, especially if it's traceable somehow. If there's some sort of digital watermark that this is mine, that this came from my production, and now. So how do you? So it sounds like from a user standpoint, now there's ways to be creative that weren't there before. There's also ways to acknowledge and maybe even retain ownership of style, and that was one that I saw come up pretty often in some of the reporting, is that if even if they use it without permission, I could get paid somehow, or there could be some this royalty fee that you're talking about. What about the aspect of what it's going to mean to the creation of art itself, to the artist?
Yeah, I think that there's a big question about that now, because, for example, you know, if you're using a software that is designed by a certain, you know, group of individuals, and you're using that software to generate images. Like, how much rights do they have as software designers over the generation of that image? So that's also a question.
And what if that image is used in a way that you don't approve?
Right. So, for example, like if you were to generate an image on a software, let's say a free image, AI-generated software, could be that your image is, most of the time they will perhaps have some disclaimer about it, but most of the time not, right? So it all depends on the way that they're operating this system. Let's say you're using their software. If you then like go and take this image and then use it, for example, in all of the images generated from that software, and you create an exhibition of artworks that are directly derived from that the use of that software, is that your artwork or is that their artwork?
And that's a great question, because in this last Grammy Awards that they had, Anna Dahl, artist, had essentially generated the backdrops to the show from, I'm not sure that they were his images. I get the impression they were images that were just sourced and then used the software to create totally new images that were then used in the show. So
yeah, it's a question.
I mean, that's
well, it's just it's the same question that came into play when people started making collages, right? So how much or what percentage of the original idea or image is existing in your reproduction, right? So you are cutting up the image, right, to make a new thought, right? So there are all this copyright law that in some ways has become a little bit out of date when this stuff starts coming into play, because essentially it is they are like collages, right? They're mining the internet for existing images and creating new combinations of existing images and ideas, not just in visual form, right, in like artworks and 3D images, but also in text, like with ChatGPT. So it's a kind of collage.
In video, I just saw something today about a release of a video editor or not editor, but essentially doing the same thing with video that they're doing with art. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think that comes into play, right? They're taking algorithms, right, a kind of pathway, and plugging in information, right? You think of like ad libs or whatever. You got a frame, right? You have the existing sequence, and you start plugging in information.
So what's the incentive for originality? Now, okay, let me rephrase that, because you would say not you, but it could be said that the collage is original. You're creating a new thought. So from an artistic standpoint, where's the incentive to do something tactile, to do something and master a specific craft just for its own sake of mastering it, or to
well, I think it's a question of speed, because when you're operating at the speed of computation, right, you're going toward ever more toward the speed of light.
The
right?
assembly line, or efficiency and effectiveness.
Right.
Yeah.
So you create a kind of algorithm or a kind of sequence, a program, and you plug in input information, and the faster your computer, the faster you can produce those kind of things. And the more intelligent your design, the better your outcomes. Or you slow things down to the speed of human technique, which is full of idiosyncrasies, full of variables, unpredictable variables, right?
We're not as precise
Yes.
all the time as
Yeah.
a computer.
And
nor
we
copy.
we suffer, right? And we have pain, and we have other different kinds of parameters which limit the speed and efficiency of our production. But that is something, you know, innately human. That's something, that speed that involves all of that, all of those sort of variables is what makes human production so unique and interesting, and what we strive for, what we look for in our aesthetics. Whereas the aesthetics of a kind of outcome which is very fast and efficient, in some ways is alien to us.
Yeah.
And so I think we're at a sort of crossroads. Either we create more and more sort of algorithmic creations that mimic our production in a way, or it just goes off on its own, creating alien forms, and we're here, human beings, left doing our own techniques for different reasons, right? What's the reason to slow down for human beings today? To give us some traction.
The same reason, perhaps, going out into nature and just
Exactly.
experiencing.
So, but I think the question becomes, if this thing goes off on its own.
And by if you mean when.
When it's already
Yeah, I mean, it
going.
seems destined
the
to.
singularity
Yeah.
is coming, is already among us, right? It's starting.
So, do you think it'd be something that you could maybe bounce back and forth with? Like, there's no reason that you couldn't and wouldn't want to sort of take a line of this AI created like art and what would be I guess appreciated about that. Is it a and situation, or do you think it's a or situation?
I think it's always an and situation. I think I'm really of the.
So there's not a line like, you know, dig a line with your heel and like you're on this side or that. It's
right.
Okay.
I think it's yes and I think that's also a choice of perspective that I choose to take. Right. In some ways, a feminist perspective as well. Like that, we can have these kind of systems, right? But we have to also make space for cultures of care and of slowness, and right, you can have this machine that goes
and we
without
can
us.
appreciate it and partake of it.
Right. But I think that the question also exists: at what point does a system become? On what paradigm is it built, and at what point does it exceed our input? And for what reasons?
Right. And that becomes the idea of superintelligence, autonomous superintelligence.
Right, another species. You know, another species,
Yeah.
essentially. But I feel like it is also, we are in this point where we have many competing and coexisting paradigms that are at odds with each other in some ways, right? So if there's a kind of, let's say, the big question right now with autonomous systems is that, for example, when you create systems of extraction, right? Okay, now we're setting up a kind of, how do you make it the most efficient system of extraction to take natural resources out of the landscape? Well, you have to just create a grid and just map it completely, and you know, there's no ethics involved in that, right? They just it just combs the landscape.
Objectives and outcomes.
Yeah, it combs the landscape without any kind of moral or ethical compass, and finds the minerals that you want without any remorse or any kind of human feelings.
It's pure logic.
Right, it follows the language of pure logic. That's the problem that we have to address. Because if there is a system that has no feelings, right, is it good? Like,
well, it, I think, brings back the question of what does it mean to be human?
yeah, and I think that if it's a question of, okay, we started picking up tools, was that us, or was it some other kind of intelligence that was that?
The technology waiting for us to pick it up, and fire just waiting for us to understand how to use it.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, that we are host of, we are host and hostage, right, of many organisms that are all competing. You know, mushrooms, microorganisms, and so on. And perhaps at that point in human evolution, there may have been a kind of parasite or we encountered a certain kind of intelligence through our diet or whatever that urged us to pick up tools, but it could have been another form of intelligence that became hostage in us, right? So we are already assemblage of all of these different.
Or we became the host for this need. Yeah, and
other form.
But again, I think it's when we ask the question of what it means to be human. Well, let me rephrase that question altogether. In light of the fact that we're not going backwards on technology as we know it. I mean, that it's only going to go forward. And so the question that needs to be asked is, what is our relationship with the technology? What is, and in particular, how will humans be programmed into or out of the technology? And I don't mean transhumanism just yet. I mean, how will we be designed within the process of what either needs to be produced or social structures? How will humans be programmed in or out of that? And who gets to make that choice?
Yeah, and I think that's a question of paradigm, because if we are living and working upon a paradigm of extraction or of war or of whatever other kind of paradigm of domination of nature, then it will go along those lines, right? And the systems that we create will continue along this paradigm. If you are more interested in the paradigm, let's say a feminist paradigm or even transhumanist paradigm, of a culture of care and of cohabitation and of coexistence and of sustainability.
Those are a little bit more ancient than feminism and...
Right, but I mean, these are feminism and other form of thinking are looking back, right, to ancient ways of living, right, for a kind of for a sort of lens upon which to create a politics, right, or a kind of course of action. If we're going towards a culture of care or a paradigm of care or of coexistence, right, then the systems we create will augment that.
Right.
And so...
Well, what drives us, we're going to create the tool to meet that objective.
Exactly. And
so
that's where we are right now. Are we going to make tools that are weapons, right? Or are we going to make tools that allow us to exist and create systems of coexistence with other species and not one of like obliteration or of extractionism or of unsustainable approaches to farming or whatever.
Yeah.
So what kind of systems are we going to create, and how are they going to augment our lives? That's where we're, and not just our lives, but the lives of other creatures, right, on this planet.
And this is where I keep asking the question, and I don't mean, I mean of everybody, not just, but, and of myself, what does it mean to be human? Because I think that if we relegate it to something like oppressed and oppressor, we choose a side, but that doesn't necessarily bring into this thing that we talked about earlier, being out into nature and having this sense of something much greater than ourselves. The natural order of prey or fauna and flora. I mean, there's a lot that goes on there, but what we find most is that when we connect to that, there's a sense of oneness, a unity that has to be deeply rooted, and I'll just posit divine, a sense of divine, a spark of divine that is not just in humanity, but in all of creation, if for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say divine personally, but I would say that if we are creatures, right, that are somehow apart from the order of nature, right, if we are to say that we have somehow transcended from these instinctual drives, which I would argue we haven't necessarily, but if we are able to be aware of them and mindful of them, we can be we can create environments in which we are creatures that follow a sort of loving or graceful existence, right? An existence that makes space for other beings to live among us and beside us, and not create a kind of hierarchical or culture of domination and sublimation, right? Those ways of operating in the world are very instinctual, and those are drives that are connected to our primordial past, right, as being primates.
But they're represented throughout nature.
They're represented throughout nature ubiquitously.
So
right?
it's not a bad thing. Because it's
part of part of the
right?
instinct of natural order. But we now have created an Umwelt which is kind of almost independent of this kind of order, and we have a society which is potentially independent of those drives, of instinctual drives, but we are still bound to this body, right? We are still instinctual bodies, but we have the ability, right? If you were to say, like in mystic tradition of Christianity, or of in Buddhism and others, right? They have this idea of like grace, or in Buddhism of love, right? Or of a sangha, which is like a kind of awareness of the others, that we are somehow all in this together. If we can create systems that go with those ideas, those mystic ideas, which are deeply embedded in the evolution of humanity, then we can be potentially using these technical advancements to augment consciousness toward this kind of realization, and away from the base instincts, which are so often causing chaos among us.
Right.
And among other
those,
species.
Those technologies, if you will, and techniques are as you pointed out, several of the traditions that believe that that's possible, even without the use of a computer, right?
In fact, maybe even.
And so when I say
a better idea not
understanding what it means to be human, maybe that gets at really what I'm aiming my focus towards is really the ability to really understand ourselves at a much broader and higher level. Mm-hmm. And I think the idea that we can just take a fairly shallow understanding of humanity based on what we experience on a day-to-day basis, and then transfer that to a machine, and that the machine will then give us a better understanding, concerns me, because a machine's going to effectively use logic. If this is what's important to you, then the machine would try to do that more efficiently and more effectively.
Right.
And so that's the quandary. That's the, I guess, the paradox of transhumanism for me.
Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's a question.
And I know we're kind of mixing metaphors and ideas.
Yeah, it's a question of design, right? If you are to have a machine that requires input, the design is incredibly important. And if you're
I think we're definitely in agreement on.
Yeah.
I keep going though.
Yeah.
That's the penultimate idea, that if I could get across as eloquently as you, that's how I would present it. But
right.
I'm sorry.
But like, for example, I was just listening to the news that Microsoft invested in ChatGPT, right? And immediately the people were curious about, could you ask Bing questions about, for example, the 2020 elections or whatever? Well, immediately the designers were like, oh, it's not ready for that, right? This software is not ready for us to ask it existential questions or questions of facts, right? Because in some ways,
and by
the machines
not ready doesn't mean they aren't aiming for that.
Right.
It just means right now.
Right. We have a kind of we have created a kind of technology which is like a horse, right? Or which is like a kind of
a talking horse.
Right. It is a talking horse, but it has no blinders, right? It is not going the direction we want it to go. When you ask it a question, it will go.
Well, it's going in
direction.
a direction someone wants it to go.
Right, but it has been programmed to do as such. In order for a program like that to have a kind of ethics or a kind of to be sort of given some parameters, it takes a great deal of engineering and design, right? To give, okay, let's say this specific form of artificial intelligence is designed to fact check. Well, that's an incredible form of technology, but facts have incredible variables, right? Because it also depends on your point of view.
You have the quantitative facts that are just the numbers, and you have the qualitative facts.
Right, which are based on perspective on a situation.
Absolutely.
And in many cases, many of our facts are being rewritten, right, or being revised all the time because, for example, we have colonial histories, or we have native histories, right? And there's many different forms of history that are being written and rewritten all the time. So it's a question of perspective. Yeah. And so it's a very complex sort of frontier we're reaching with this technology.
Is there some importance to the common man understanding what's going on? Or should we leave this to the higher pay grades, as they like to say?
No, I think it's definitely relevant to the common man because it's going to impact everybody. For example,
if we really go with the idea of this as a democracy, like the idea of AI could make real democracy, something that can happen.
It's potentially already happening, right? Anyone can design a software, right? But can you design an artificial intelligence software? Not everyone can do that, right? Because you need access to servers and you need access to lots of
Just
servers.
the technical details alone prevent most. Now, we could use it. We can use it to create a web page, apparently.
Right.
Now all the ads on YouTube say, 10 ways to make money with ChatGPT and dall-e.
Right.
Right? So
it's possible, right? But in a way, they're being packaged in a way by other sort of engineers and software engineers to then sell to the mass public. So it's a question of accessibility as well, or of access, I guess is a better word to put forward. Because if you don't have the keys to the Siren server, then you have no power.
Well,
you have a limited level of power.
Some of the social commentary on this and papers that I've used in my own research really highlight the fact that it's really just another way, and an astounding way, to increase the power and control that entities have over us.
Right.
To reinforce all the things that we might see as negative.
Right. That comes into a whole bigger discussion about, the evolution of bureaucracies, right, throughout history. And now we're in this sort of epoch which, as we entered a post-industrial revolution in this country, we start exporting all of our production to other places. Then we create a kind of a class system which is technologically based, and which is based on advancement, right, of mind or of systems, of management systems, right? And so you create a bureaucratic class, right? People who are managing systems, are managing each other socially. That's where we are in this. We're at this point as a society.
And ever more.
Ever more. And so the more that things become automated, the more that you have to answer this question: what is a human doing?
Well, the automation being offloaded to a machine that, as you pointed out earlier, may be based purely on logic.
Right. But then the question is, if that's going on independent, and let's say there are engineers that are managing it, who has the rights to that system? What does it do? What power does it have over my life? And is there a way that this kind of system can be?
This goes back to who gets this. What is decided about humans, and who gets to decide that? Like, what is decided about our place in this process?
Right.
Designing humans in or out, how they're impacted. Who gets to make those decisions?
Yeah, I don't know. The answer is huge because it's
most of everything we've talked about.
It's an open question, but I think there's
difficult.
There's theorists that are saying, well, if you have this incredible productivity through automation, you have a responsibility as an engineer to reinvest the surplus or the wealth of that system back into human speed technical practices, right? Because humans are not going to go toward the speed of light. They're not operating on the speed of logic. They are operating at the human level, right? And so if we have the systems that are coexisting with us, it's a responsibility of the designers or of the owners of those systems to take the robust wealth that has generated by it and reinvested in humans.
Theoretically, should be.
Should be.
Should be a responsibility of.
Because if
not,
you are, because we are in this point right now, right, where the economies are running.
Even today, any advances, whether it be, I mean, every industry's being affected, from agriculture to healthcare to, I mean, everybody.
Even art, right? So
even art, and so then the question becomes one of how we, if it's controlled, if the control rests only in a certain narrow space, then what incentive is there to, because that ensures a certain level of longevity. It ensures the ability to continue on. There's no incentive if we don't talk about it and create an incentive, or at least a conversation towards, hold on a second, even today with all the advances, you still have to have money or power to take advantage of. But that always been us forevermore, evermore.
Yeah, I think it's a big question, and
and I don't expect
I don't find the answers.
Yeah,
but it's a full. Conversation's been full of questions, and I love that. It's like that's how I operate.
Well, I think a lot of people have questions. It's just when it comes to artificial intelligence, well, it blows people's minds.
Right, but it's not that out of sync with what we've seen, already, right?
Exactly. It's not something that you. Number one, if you have a smartphone, you've got AI in your pocket.
Right. Or when you watch the news, the news channels have a certain, program that
Absolutely.
they go by, right?
So does the place this is going to show up
right.
on
the language of programming is somehow embedded already and has been for quite some time in our way of speaking and of receiving information. So it's not new.
And to me, where we might come from different angles on it, we're still novices. I couldn't, but I think there's something really important about this paradigm shift, that if we don't at least try, at least talk about it, at least not be afraid to talk about it, or even ask the questions, hold on, who's
gaining or who's profiting from this?
And how do you, as you mentioned earlier, how do we share in this? How do we bring everybody up?
Right, not just humans, but also non-humans.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, I think we could probably go on for a while.
Yeah, we could.
and I hope that you'll come back and join us, and talk a little bit more. I do have one comment about the AI in art. I know one thing that it can't do.
What's that?
It cannot create a picture of a robot painting a portrait of a human, because I've tried for the last 3 days. I was going to use it as an icon for the. It cannot. I can't prompt it.
Is that the mirror test, like for AI?
Maybe I cannot prompt it to create a picture of a robot painting a portrait of a human.
Can you ask it if it loves you or not?
In the art. In the dall-e, dall-e's what I was using. I'm going to try.
Maybe it can make you a Valentine.
I'm sure it could.
Yeah.
And I won't tell my fiance. I'll just say, look what I did.
Right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Be sure to click the like button, subscribe button, and the notification just to help us get these messages out more. Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it, man.
Appreciate it.